Hi, my name is Amy Livingston. I'm a speech language pathologist and I've been practicing about 16 years. My primary focus has been child language. I've worked in public schools, outpatient rehab, and the university setting. With language, you have to primarily focus on content, form, and use. And the majority of my caseload has been deaf and hard of hearing, children with autism, and children with severe disabilities. So working with AAC, low-tech, high-tech devices. So when you're dealing with language, you always have to think about what is functional for the client. So depending on their level of ability versus their level of achievement. So if someone has a language learning disability, their achievement is actually going to be much lower than what their ability is. So their ability is their IQ. So their ability is going to be maybe here, and then their achievement is going to be here. So that's a learning disability. So we know there's a reason why they're not achieving at their ability. So then we have to figure out what this gap is. So we look at receptive language, we look at expressive language, and then we try to catch them up to this ability. Then if we're looking at someone who has Down syndrome or autism or someone who has an intellectual disability, their ability is going to be lower. But we still try to achieve at that ability. So finding out what that ability is can be a little more challenging sometimes, especially with children with autism, because their ability may be a lot higher than they're letting us know. That spectrum is pretty broad. We can go anywhere from pervasive developmental disorder all the way up to Asperger's. And so the spectrum is pretty broad. So sometimes they've got some really high receptive language skills, but maybe not so much high expressive language skills. So trying to get that information from them can be challenging at times. But the goal is ultimately still the same. We're working on language, whether that is content, form, or use. So you always have to think about those three things when you're dealing with language. I've loved working with children. I have worked with adults in language as well, but primarily children. So with my adults though, I've worked with people who have CVAs, which is the same thing as a stroke, and you work on receptive and expressive language, content, form, and use, same thing. Just it's going to be on a different level because you're working with adults now, and this is more rehabilitation. So you're working on something maybe they once had and then they lost it. So then you work on understanding questions and understanding topics that they once worked on. My favorite client that I ever worked with was a 65-year-old. He was in his 50s when he had a stroke. He spoke 4 languages, was working internationally when he had the episode, and lost all the languages, woke up in the hospital and everybody was speaking, he was in Paris, everybody was speaking French to him, he couldn't understand the French. He had a little bit of English, but not much. We think it's global aphasia. We still have different views on that. There's several speech pathologists that have looked at him. It could be transcortical aphasia, it might have been global aphasia, and there might be some Broca's aphasia in there. But he definitely has aphasia, and he has a little bit of apraxia, which is some motor planning with his speech. But he was brilliant. He was probably one of the top executives in his field, making multi-millions of dollars as a high exec, and then he had this stroke, and then it changed everything. His family had to move from Paris to Mississippi. Financially, the good thing was the company still, under French law, the company still has to pay you the salary where you were when you're injured. So he still receives his financial income, which is great. But he so badly wants to communicate on the level he once was, and he can't. I mean, when he gets emails from high execs, I mean, it's just, he can do basic communication, but he works so hard and he tries so hard. But even when he's trying to tell a story about something, there's a lot of circumlocution, which is talking around the topic. And so we try to work on that. We try to work on just basic communication as far as who you're talking about, when are you talking about it, what are you talking about. He'll start a story in the middle of the story. So we have no background information. We don't know if he's talking about his mother, his sister, his daughter. So there's a lot of clarification and some pragmatic judgment in there, working on those skills. That is the use of language. So that's what my a little bit of example of what I've done with adults. And one thing I haven't mentioned is when I worked with the deaf and hard of hearing, that was primarily language and speech as well. But language with the deaf and hard of hearing was challenging because the population that I worked with, they were primarily fluent in ASL. And that's American Sign Language. And when you are speaking American Sign Language, it is a completely different language. And so I had to learn that language so that I could communicate with them. And it was challenging at first because they're all intellectually, they were all very typically developing intellectually. So their disability, and they didn't even see it as a disability, was that they're deaf and hard of hearing. So you're dealing with a whole different culture. And so you have to make sure you know about that culture. And I wanted to be a part of that culture, but because I'm hearing, I could never be in their culture. So they eventually, after a few months, they started realizing I was willing to learn their language. And so then they were willing to come into my world too and then learn my language. So I would work on speech and language in English, and then they would teach me ASL. And so as you can see, there are so many populations, there's so many different people who have language disorders, and there's so much we can do as speech language pathologists. And I really enjoy what I do, and I especially love language. It's so complex, and there's so much more to learn. And so I hope to continue to learn and grow as a speech language pathologist.